Okay, this is part 6, Your Amazing Destiny, the Gentile promise, and Israel's future. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jim McCotter. We find in Romans 9, 6 through 9, quote, "Well then, has God failed to fulfill his promise to Israel? No, for not all who are born into the nation of Israel are truly members of God's people. Being descendants of Abraham doesn't make them truly Abraham's children. For the scriptures say, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted, though Abraham had other children too. This means that Abraham's physical descendants are not necessarily children of God. Only the children of the promise are considered to be Abraham's children. For God had promised, quote, I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son, end quote. The reason most Christians don't understand or misinterpret Romans 9 is because they are not reading it in the light of first century understanding, only having, at that time, a Septuagint Bible, which was the only Old Testament Bible. So, all theology was confirmed by only the Old Testament. Today, many address this subject in 16th century argument of Calvin versus Armenian. And today, most evangelicals hardly know the Old Testament, much less listen to the apostle in Septuagint Old Testament thinking. But in the first century, that was the only way Paul could be understood, especially with Jewish believers, which at that time may have been the majority of believers. Now, here the apostle Paul continues his address, speaking nationally in reference to Israel. Paul asks in verse 6, quote, has God failed to fulfill his promise to Israel? End quote. That is a logical question in light of Paul just declaring that Israel had been cut off from Christ, the Messiah, in Romans 9:3, as Paul also reiterated about Israel having been cut off in Romans chapter 11, 22, and 24. Paul answers his own question, though, in verse 6 and 7. Quote, no, for not all who are born into the nation of Israel are truly members of God's people. Being descendants of Abraham doesn't make them truly Abraham's children, end quote. That answer had to be a shock to the Jews and their pride. But Paul goes on to confirm his answer with what no Jew could refute, quoting their own Old Testament scriptures in verse 7 and 9. Quote, for the scriptures say, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted, though Abraham had other children too. This means that Abraham's physical descendants are not necessarily children of God. Only the children of the promise are considered to be Abraham's children. For God had promised, I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son, end quote. Abraham had many children, but he had only one child, Isaac, promised by God. And that was a miracle birth. Sarah had never had a child before and was now 90 years old, and Abraham was 100 years old. So God said, only the descendants of Isaac will be counted. Here was where Paul quoted the Old Testament verse in Genesis 21:12, quote, for Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted, end quote. Paul specifically declared three things. Number one, quote, not all who are born into the nation of Israel are truly members of God's people. Number two, being a physical descendant of Abraham, quote, doesn't make them truly Abraham's children, end quote. And number three, quote, only the children of the promise are considered to be Abraham's children, end quote. And this meant essentially three things. People from other nations, Gentiles, can now become, quote, members of God's people. And number two, no people can become God's people by any works they can do, any more than having a baby when you're 100 years old or 90 years old. Number three, the only way to become God's people is to believe, quote, the promise. God's promise to believe today, Jesus said in John 3:16, quote, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life, end quote. But at that time, the Jews had been looking for only one of God's Old Testament promises to be fulfilled, the reestablishment of their kingdom, Israel. for Israel to no longer be under Rome, but to have their own independent nation back again. After Jesus' resurrection, this is what the apostles kept asking Jesus about in Acts 1, verse 6 through 7. Quote, so when the apostles were with Jesus, they kept asking him, quote, Lord, has the time come for you to free Israel and restore our kingdom? End quote. Jesus replied, quote, the Father alone has the authority to set those dates and times, and they are not for you to know. End quote. Here Jesus confirms the promise of restoring the kingdom of Israel again. But it was not for that time. But that time would come. Almost 2,000 years later, in a single day, May 14, 1948, Israel became its own independent nation again, but not yet fully restored as a kingdom with Jesus as its king. God had Isaiah prophesy in the 5th century BC that this would happen, and even how it would happen. Isaiah 66:8 says, quote, who has ever seen anything as strange as this? Who ever heard of such a thing? Has a nation ever been born in a single day? Has a country ever come forth in a mere moment? End quote. No, this has never happened in all of history with any other nation in the world before, except Israel, in a mere moment, in a single day, May 14, 1948. In the 6th century BC, God showed the prophet Ezekiel how Israel would then grow and develop as a nation before it would become God's people, coming alive again with God's breath. Ezekiel 37, 1 through 11, quote, the Lord took hold of me, and I was carried away by the Spirit of the Lord to a valley filled with bones. He led me all around among the bones that covered the valley floor. They were scattered everywhere across the ground and were completely dried out. Then he asked me, Son of man, can these bones become living people again? O sovereign Lord, I replied, you alone know that answer to that. Then he said to me, speak a prophetic message to these bones and say, dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I'm going to put breath into you and make you live and live again. I will put flesh and muscles on you and cover you with skin. I will put breath into you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I spoke this message just as he told me. Suddenly as I spoke, there was a rattling noise all across the valley. The bones of each body came together and attached themselves as complete skeletons. Then as I watched, muscles and flesh formed over the bones. Then skin formed to cover their bodies, but they still had no breath in them. Then he said to me, speak a prophetic message to the winds, Son of man. Speak a prophetic message and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, O breath, from the four winds, breathe into these dead bodies so they may live again. So I spoke the message he had commanded me, and breath came into their bodies. They all came to life and stood up on their feet. Oh, a great army. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones represent the people of Israel. End quote. There were stages for Israel to become complete and finally to live again with the breath of God. It looks like Israel's skeleton bones surely came together on May 14, 1948. As a nation, Israel has been growing ever since with muscle and flesh. But at this writing, as is evident, God's breath has yet to blow on Israel to come alive as the glorious kingdom with King Jesus.